Thanks very much, Laura. That's great. Well, we might we've pretty much used up our time now, so we might pass on to Kamila. So I'll just share the screen here, and that's it, isn't it? Yep.
Yes.
And we'll just switch this over. Away we go.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kamila Svobodova. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Social Responsibility in Mining. In this presentation, I would like to introduce an assessment framework that was designed to map the global potential of countries to phase out coal in their transitions to low carbon economies. This study was done in collaboration with my colleagues from CSRN, John Owen, Jill Harris, and Sandy Warden. I go directly to the assessment framework. I think that everyone knows, like, energy transition is complex. There are a lot of challenges, especially imbalances in the transition parts of the countries, and we really need a rapid and global solution. So the assessment framework, the aim of this assessment framework is to identify groups of countries with similar conditions, roles and path directions, and speed of change in energy transition. The framework is formed from 3 indicators: economic health, dependence on coal, and carbon contribution to climate change. Economic health, as you can see in the scheme, economic health and dependence on coal show the capacity and ability to exit coal, and carbon contribution to climate change indicate urgency to phase out coal. And each indicator is compiled from multiple measures. We used 8 measures in the framework, and these measures, so economic health is compiled from Human Development Index, GDP, and GDP growth. These measures provide an understanding of countries' level of human development, the size of its overall economy, and long-term economic performance. The dependence on coal is compiled from coal rents, coal share in energy mix, and imports of coal. Coal rents show the profit from coal in GDP, and coal share in the mix and coal imports indicate reliance on coal for national energy supply in particular countries. Carbon contribution to climate change comprises 2 measures: carbon production and carbon production increase in the last decade. And on the slide, you can see in the table, we use different sources of data with different years, because we always use the newest one, always the last available. And we also use different thresholds for each measure in groupings of the countries that I'm going to talk later about. From a complete list of 264 countries listed by World Bank, we selected 118 countries for this research study. These countries had full data on HDI, GDP, and carbon emission. To examine the relationships and also to test the strength of the relationships and direction, and also statistics significance, we used Pearson's R correlation tests and scatter plots in IBM SPSS. Like, all credits for statistics go to Jill Harris. So we identified in the framework, some significant linkages between the measures, 5 statistically significant strong and very strong, and 7 statistically significant moderate relationships. As you can see in the correlation diagram, so GDP is strongly linked with most of the measures. Very similar production of carbon dioxide and HDI and GDP growth. These four measures, they're linked across the framework with different indicators, but the codependency measures, they are mostly linked with each other. As you can see, coal sharing energy mix with coal rents and coal imports. Very strong, almost linear positive correlation was identified between GDP and carbon production. In this scatter plot, as you can see, we overlaid these two measures with coal dependency, and we are getting a little bit more concrete picture of the global composition of potential to phase out. So if you look at just this upper corner quartile, you can see that all the leading countries with the highest GDP and also the highest carbon contribution are red, which means they're highly dependent on coal. After mapping the significant linkages across the assessment framework, we divided countries according to their capacity and ability to transit from coal. This gave us like four groups of countries, and then we further categorized them based on their urgency to exit coal into 8 groups. And we indicated 5 roles in global energy transition for these 8 groups. You can see the geographical, the geography of the roles in global energy transition in this map. And I will talk about the groups on next slides. So the group A countries represent 21 economically healthy countries with high levels of coal dependency. 16 of these countries are major contributors of carbon emissions, led by China, United States, and Russia. And we call these countries recalcitrant nations. The remaining 5 countries, Chile, Colombia, Israel, Hong Kong, and Slovakia, are described as late-stage transition leaders and show medium carbon emission production. Because human and economic developments of these countries are high, and they face a high level of urgency to exit coal, they have the capacity and, more importantly, the responsibility to lead the transition. The group B countries includes 28 nations that are highly dependent on coal, but at the same time, they are not economically healthy enough to make the change without extensive external support. These are called late-stage transition followers. To successfully transit from coal, these nations would have to diversify their energy mix, develop human capital for the future energy system, and also reduce fossil fuel subsidies. The group C represents 27 nation states that are economically healthy with a low dependency on coal. The first subgroup, early stage transition followers, includes 13 countries rated as major emitters, led by Germany, followed by Iran and Canada. Although these countries are less dependent on coal, their contribution to global carbon emissions is significant. They have high human and economic development, and they are capable of making the change in decreasing the emissions. The second subgroup is called early stage transition leaders, represents 14 developed nations that already follow a greener path of development. These countries report medium to low production of carbon emissions, and they are wealthy and have high levels of human development. They include, for instance, Austria, Denmark, Finland, Portugal, or New Zealand, and they have the capacity to be energy transition role models. Group D includes 42 countries that are less dependent on coal with less healthy human and economic development. They are mainly post-Soviet, African, and emerging Asian countries, and these countries have a low capacity to deal with the significant political and economic changes needed to increase their competitiveness in renewable energy markets. Their role in the transition is to achieve affordable and reliable power supply and to stabilize their economic and human developments. We describe them as late stage transition followers. Just some few perspective conclusions, main points of this research study. The difficult process of coal phase out is more likely to be pursued by independent and transparent governments in wealthy countries in groups A and C that have the capacity to bear major political, social, and economic risks. Global policy coordination is required if we are to avoid a situation where wealthier and willing nations, so mainly group C2, determine the pace of change for emerging countries, where access to affordable coal is a clear pathway to realizing human development goals, while economically powerful nations in group A1 resist from the sidelines. We showed significant correlation between coal imports and GDP, and also coal imports and carbon production, which indicate the importance of coal imports and exports for transition pathways and their interconnections and national economic development. Because coal mining relies on the locations of deposit, the implications of energy transition will be substantial for regions where local economy is primarily coal dependent. More robust discussion is needed about social and economically just alternatives for coal dependent regions. So this is where we are focusing our research now, mainly is the regional aspects of energy transitions. And I think there will be more presentations on this. This research study was published in Applied Energy in the beginning of this year. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kamila. Do we have any questions either from the, so if you're online, questions in the Q&A or questions in the audience?
Thank you for the presentation. You've shown a very important graph where you show direct correlation between CO2 production from the coal and GDP. And, you know, if someone looks just for that, the solution would be to reduce the GDP and solve the problem, but that's not the solution. But based on historical data, do you have some conclusion for the countries who reduce the dependency of coal, how that affects their GDP? Because that would be also guiding to, I mean, put our mind to rest that we don't need to compromise GDP in order to reduce CO2. Thanks.
No, we just actually did this, what I presented in the assessment framework. So we based our analysis on GDP and GDP growth. Yeah, there are a lot of assessment frameworks of energy transition, and just the complexity of indicators is really significant. And yeah, I would say we have this, and our other research is more on local, really local measures, so local, like regional indicators for regional GDP and so on. Don't know if I replied probably.
Sorry, just to add on this point that one of the big reasons that Switzerland, for example, is managing to get GDP without producing CO2 is that it's creating value from CO2 being burned in some of the other countries, being produced in some of the other countries. So these graphs don't include imports of coal-produced commodities, which then that country manages to add more value to somehow. And just to add an extra dimension to Vlad's comment.
Yeah.
So over to you, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. So coal imports are in the coal dependency. We combine coal imports, coal share, and coal rents. And it's like, yeah, the diversity is there, and it didn't have to show that the imports are measured.
For a novice in this area, have you separated out met coal from thermal? So you're talking a lot about coal for energy consumption, but there is coal here for steel production.
No, we didn't because of the data. It's not available for global scale. So we consider coal as a commodity coal. We didn't separate. Thanks for the point. It's definitely important.
Do we have any other question? I had one. There's, since you've done this work and produced this paper, I see 2 countries up at the upper right-hand end of that diagram that have announced zero emissions by 2050. Does that have any effect on your analysis, or is that really a completely independent development?
It doesn't have effect on the analysis, but we discussed this in the discussion of the paper. Yeah, definitely. There are differences of approaching the energy transition, and this is more about like the previous behavior, the assessment framework.
Do we have any other questions? If not, what I wanted to do, Lisa, I'm going to put you on the spot because we had a question from Andy Reynolds that was a good one actually, but we ran out of time to answer it at the time. So I'm going to ask it and then hand over my microphone, which is, do the consortium contracts include any behavioral or relational obligations to promote trust and flexibility?
Thank you for that question. I don't entirely understand it. Could you elaborate?
Okay, behavioral and relational obligations to promote trust and flexibility.
Okay, I guess our consortium has a strictly technical focus. We have not engaged in areas of social responsibility, if that is what your question is heading. No, we have not gone in that direction. Currently, the focus is purely technical. However, in future iterations, should this consortium framework should go forward, we could put that forth to our sponsors to see how they feel. Kim, do you want to add anything to that?
Because I think the question was more around standards of or agreed modes of behavior within the consortium in terms of trust and flexibility.
We have put provisions within our contract agreement that all members need to follow a code of conduct. That we have used one of the company's templates for what it is, and we are certainly bound by our own UQ's code of conduct, and each of the companies is bound by their own code of conduct, but also by one that was commonly agreed to be a good template for code of conduct, so that any particular instances of malfeasance or bad behavior would be dealt with if they arrive. However, it's good to have these provisions in place, but we currently have just the most amazing group of people together, where we haven't encountered not even a hint of potential bad behavior. Everyone's just super excited to really get engaged with the technology. So
great. All right. Any other questions for any of the other presenters this morning? Oh, we've got okay, yeah. Andy said, more a question of how the consortium members work, and then he says, thanks, that's exactly what I was asking about. So we finally managed to hone in on the question there. Is there anything else from anyone? If not, then we can head out into what I think will be a cooler part of the building, because we seem to be having some air conditioning problems here. And could you join me first in thanking all of the speakers this morning, and then we'll be back, and Paul Gao will be chairing the next session. We'll be back at 10 past 11 in 20 minutes time. So thanks very much, everyone.